At 25 minutes past 5 on the afternoon of November 19th, 1941, a signal lamp began flashing across 1,000 meters of the Indian Ocean, and Captain Theodor Detmers ran out of sea to hide in. The lamp belonged to HMAS Sydney, a light cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy. 8 6-inch guns aimed across open water at a merchant hull with no armour anywhere in it. Torpedo tubes. A ship built for exactly one kind of argument. The flashes spelled out 4 words. Hoist your secret call. Detmers stood on the bridge of a ship whose nameboard said Straat Malakka, a Dutch merchant steamer bound for Batavia. 80 minutes earlier, the cruiser had asked him in the ordinary way to identify himself, and he had run up the 4 flags of a Dutch freighter and watched her come on. That much a disguise can do. For almost a year at sea, it had worked on everyone who looked at it. This was different. The real Straat Malakka carried a secret identification signal, issued by the Allies, changed regularly, known only to friendly ships. Detmers did not have it. No German alive had it. He had 393 men aboard and nearly 400 naval mines in the holds. The cruiser lay stopped, engines still, at a range a court of inquiry would one day describe with 2 words: point blank. In his own journal, Detmers recorded the thought that decided everything. Further delay can only make the situation worse, and then a colder observation about his enemy. Cruiser stops engines, therefore completely unsuspecting. At 5:30, he gave the order. Drop screens. The Dutch flag came down and the German battle flag went up. Steel plates fell away along the freighter's flank and gun barrels swung out of a hull that had no business carrying them. 6 seconds, by his own count, to stop being a merchant ship. The first salvo fell short. The ones after it did not. They struck the cruiser's bridge and her gun director, the eyes and brain of the ship. Until the 5th German salvo, Sydney did not reply at all. A torpedo hit her 20 meters back from the stem, beside the forward turret, and her forward end dipped into the sea and rose again. What followed took about half an hour. Then the burning cruiser turned away to the south, moving slowly, and disappeared into the failing light. From the German decks, they watched her glow on the horizon until about 10 that night. Then the glow went out. There were 645 men aboard HMAS Sydney. Not one of them was ever seen alive again. And every word you have just heard, every time, every distance, every order, comes from one source: the men who fired. No Australian survived. No distress call was ever received. For 67 years there was no wreck, no battlefield, no camera on the seabed. The entire history of how 645 men died rested on the testimony of the men who killed them, taken down in interrogation huts on the far side of the world's emptiest coastline. This film is about what Australia did with that testimony. How you question 300 prisoners who have every reason to lie. How the first version of the story came out wrong, and how the errors were hunted down one by one. Why the enemy's account was believed, decades before anyone could check it. And what happened in 2008, when a robot camera finally sank 2.5 kilometres to the bottom of the Indian Ocean, and the metal began to testify. Part 1. The Wrong Men. In Fremantle, the first sign was an empty berth. HMAS Sydney was due back from an escort run on November 20th. She did not come in. For a day, nobody worried aloud. Warships kept radio silence at sea, and Sydney was the most famous ship in the Australian Navy, a veteran of the Mediterranean with a sunk Italian cruiser on her record. Ships like that are late, not lost. When she was 36 hours overdue, the Naval Board started asking questions by signal, carefully, the way you ask when you do not want to say what you are thinking. Have you any information? Direct methods have been used to communicate with her. The answer, when it came, was worse than silence. On the evening of November 24th, a message arrived from the British tanker Trocus, relayed from Singapore. She had stopped in the open ocean northwest of Fremantle and taken aboard 25 men from a floating raft. German naval men, in a stretch of sea where no German warship was supposed to exist. Then the coast itself started giving people back. Germans came ashore on foot at a waterhole called 17-Mile Well, north of Carnarvon, and the next day at Red Bluff, further up the same empty coastline. Boats were found at sea and emptied. The coastal steamer Kulinda took one, the patrol vessel Yandra another. On the 26th, the liner Centaur brought in a boatload that included a compact, precise officer who identified himself as the captain of the German raider Kormoran. And it turned out the ocean liner Aquitania had been first of all. She had pulled 26 Germans off a raft on November 23rd, kept radio silence about it, and delivered them, of all places, to the city of Sydney. One of the raft groups had been adrift 4 nights and 3 days with half a bottle of water, a canister of biscuits, and 2 bottles of brandy. They rationed the brandy. Not everyone had been that disciplined or that lucky. Of the roughly 80 Germans who died, only about 20 had been killed in the battle itself. Some 60 drowned in the darkness afterwards, when an overloaded rubber raft capsized alongside their sinking ship. The sea did not distinguish between winners and losers that night. By the end of the week, the count was in. 318 men had come out of the ocean alive, 315 Germans, and 3 Chinese laundrymen the raider had taken off a British freighter she sank months before. From HMAS Sydney, nothing. The air search found an Australian naval lifebelt and later 2 empty Carly floats drifting far from where anyone had been told to look. Catalinas flew search patterns for a week. A Dutch cruiser was pulled off its route to help. On November 30th, the search was called off, and the Prime Minister told the country what the Navy already knew. Of Sydney's total complement of 42 officers and 603 ratings, not one survived. 1 ship, 1 afternoon. More than a third of all the men the Royal Australian Navy would lose in the entire Second World War. It was the worst fortnight the Australian Navy would ever have. Before the month was out, the sloop HMAS Parramatta had been torpedoed off Tobruk, and when the Admiralty in London finally sent its condolences, one signal carried both ships' names. In London, the Admiralty's war diary shows how little anyone actually knew. The first entry about the rescued Germans guesses at the name of their ship, possibly Kormoran. 645 men were gone, and the Royal Navy did not yet know so much as what had killed them. Australia now held more than 300 prisoners of war, and precisely one path to the truth. The only living witnesses to the destruction of an Australian cruiser wore the uniform of the men who had destroyed her. Part 2. The Interrogation Machine. On December 2nd, 1941, a Rear Admiral put the problem on paper. Rear Admiral John Crace, commanding the Australian squadron, issued written instructions for the interrogation of the Cormoran's crew, and the document survives in the file. It is not a heroic document. It is a procedural one, and that is exactly why it worked. Segregation first. It is of paramount importance that parties who are already segregated remain segregated until the interrogation has been completed. Keep the groups apart until each has been questioned so that no man can learn what the others have said. Then the legal lines. Force is not to be employed. A prisoner cannot be compelled to give information. But, the instruction adds, it is to be impressed on the prisoner that he is not allowed to lie. And then the sentence that tells you what 1941 actually felt like. It is appreciated that this is a dull and laborious task. Officers are earnestly requested, it says, to keep plugging away at the job. The motive on offer is not justice and not memory. Your efforts, Crace writes, may lead to the destruction of more than one enemy supply ship or raider. The war was still on. The dead were dead. The living wanted the next raider. So the machine started grinding. Navy interrogators worked the camps in Western Australia. Lieutenant Commander Rycroft at Carnarvon, Commander Ramage, Commander Descheno sitting alongside a Dutch naval officer, Commander Salm, because the victim of the impersonation deserved a seat in the room. Captain Farncombe questioned the men the tanker had rescued. Crace himself flew across the continent, and 3,000 kilometres away, in a camp at Liverpool outside the city of Sydney, Army officers of Eastern Command questioned the group the Aquitania had landed, separately. knowing nothing of what the Navy was hearing in the West. Two services, two states, two independent channels, converging on one desk in Melbourne. The first picture they assembled was wrong. The Army's summary, dated December 1st, put the battle 130 miles due west of Perth. The real position was 700 kilometres further north. It had the fight starting and ending an hour early. It counted 10 to 12 sunken ships, mentioned 2 women prisoners, and confessed in writing that it is not understood how the raider was armed with torpedo tubes. 11 days after the battle, Australian intelligence did not yet believe the weapon that had probably decided it. That memo is the most honest thing in the whole file, because it shows you what enemy testimony looks like before it has been worked. Not a smooth story. A pile of fragments, some misheard, some misremembered, some withheld. The truth was not received. It was extracted, the slow way. You can watch it happen. One page in the file is a worksheet in an officer's handwriting, headed simply K Engagement. Down the left margin, prisoners' names. Beside each name, what that man claimed. Timmer. The first hit destroyed the radio. No time to signal Germany. Brune. Worked a 15-centimetre gun amidships. Both ships opened fire together, distance under 2 kilometres. Otter, flagged in the margin. The German war flag went up at the start of the action, ready unfurled, visible as soon as it was hoisted. Where the claims collided, the officer put a question mark. One man's estimate of the signalling distance gets a bracketed query, because the analyst could already see it was impossible. They chase details that sound absurd until you understand them. A petty officer named Jorgensen was asked about the trademarks on the ship's buckets. Buckets. Because a bucket stamped by a Bremen ironworks could tie this raider to a supply network, and the name of a supply ship could kill more raiders than a salvo. The interrogators tested him with the name Atlantis, another German raider. The file records the result like a lab note. The name conveys nothing to him. Prisoners were made to draw the Kormoran from memory, deck by deck, and the drawings were compiled into a diagram and attached to the report. The raider's route across 2 oceans was partly reconstructed from a censored letter a prisoner wrote home, and when the final report listed the 12 prisoners whose evidence had been most useful, there, among the gunners and wireless operators, stands Edmund Lipinski, the ship's tailor. Nobody is a small witness to a man who asked the right questions. The Germans did not make it easy. The file preserves the refusals verbatim. A sailor named Knaute. As a soldier of Germany, I refuse to talk. Petty Officer Weinig declined to reveal his captain's orders, courteously and firmly, and the interrogator noted the courtesy. Beside one man's answers, a margin note in pencil. He evaded all answers. The radio operators, as a class, would not discuss their equipment. This, strangely, is part of why the record convinces. 300 men repeating an agreed script do not refuse, they perform. These men behaved like what they were. Disciplined sailors improvising under questioning, some proud, some frightened, some stubbornly silent. And they contradicted each other, which mattered even more. Jorgensen was interrogated 3 times. On the 3rd pass, he corrected his own earlier answers. And on December 4th, he told the interrogators something that reframed the entire encounter. The Kormoran had been trying to lay her mines off the Western Australian coast, and Sydney had interrupted the attempt. If that testimony is straight, then the cruiser did not merely stumble into a raider. She stopped nearly 400 mines from going into the sea lanes of her own coast at the price of everyone aboard her. The wireless men gave up their secrets grudgingly, but what they gave was gold. The operator Hans Linker, 22 years old, merchant marine before the war, walked his interrogator through the raider's radio room. 4 receivers, 2 transmitters, watches of 12 hours. And then he drew a distinction that only a radio operator would think to draw. Yes, he said. On the day of the battle, they had put out a distress call in the name of Straat Malakka, twice, on the 600-metre wavelength. That was to pull attention away from themselves as the cruiser closed, but luring ships in with faked distress traffic. the oldest accusation in the raiders' trade that they never did. The practice was considered too dangerous. It was a strange line for a guilty crew to draw. A liar defending his ship's honor claims innocence of everything. Linker described the false flag, the false name, and the false distress signal without being pushed, and denied only the one tactic his navy actually regarded as reckless. Testimony with edges, again. Detmers himself sat for interrogation on December 2nd, 13 days after the battle. He gave his crew as about 400. The muster the Navy later reconstructed says 393. He answered questions about the Gestapo, about morale in Germany, about a propaganda officer aboard. He mentioned, almost socially, that he had visited Australia before, in 1933, as a young officer in the cruiser Köln. Pressed about his mission, he gave the interrogators a short lecture in Raider Doctrine that they wrote down word for word because it was intelligence of the highest grade. Sinking 10 ships a year was not the point, he said. The presence of a raider has more effect in the delays and rerouting it causes than in the actual tonnage it sinks. His orders were not to hunt, but to be known to exist, to stay afloat, and to make an entire ocean slow down and look over its shoulder. One disguised freighter, taxing the shipping of half the world. And he explained a detail that sounds like an excuse until you check the geometry of it. Asked why he had not replied to the cruiser's signal lamp, he said his ship carried no big signaling searchlight because merchant ships do not carry them, and he was disguised as a merchant ship. The costume had no pocket for the tool he needed. The disguise that protected him also gagged him. By the end, the trap he had built had exactly one exit, and it was the guns. Taken across hundreds of pages, the interrogations assemble something no single liar could fake. A world. The crew had been at sea nearly a year and had seen land exactly once, an island 30 miles off, noted like an omen. They fought the battle in white tropical uniform, with warm clothes underneath, because the ship had been creeping south into colder water for weeks. There had been no fresh fruit or vegetables the entire voyage, only tins and vitamin tablets. Vegetables had been promised from Germany and never came. Their doctors admitted surprise at how well the men's minds had held up. 4 Chinese laundrymen, taken from a sunken British freighter, worked aboard for special coins that could only be spent at the ship's canteen. None of this was the battle. All of it was checkable against everything else, and it checked. Investigators call this incidental corroboration. The truth of the boring parts is the strongest evidence for the terrible parts. Then there is the signals question, and this is where the file turns into a detective story. What exactly did Sydney flash across the water at 4:05 when she first challenged the stranger? Detmers, under interrogation on December 2nd, said the cruiser signaled the letters NNP and then did something interrogators love. He deferred to a specialist. Albach will know, he said, which searchlight signal was received. Albach, the signal's petty officer, was questioned a week later. He said NNF, or maybe NNP. He admitted he was not certain of the letters at 7 miles. Later, in his own written report, Detmers stated the signal flatly as NNJ. 3 witnesses, worth of letters from 2 men. So the investigators did what you do with unreliable memory. They took it to a document. The International Code of Signals, 1931 edition, sits in the file with the relevant pages flagged. NNF decodes as a question about time signals. NNP decodes as a fragment. Am is are. Both are gibberish in context. NNJ decodes as, you should make your signal letters. And here is the elegant part. Albach, who could not remember the letters, had correctly remembered the meaning. He testified that he understood the cruiser to be demanding the ship's signal letters. Only one 3-letter hoist in the entire codebook carries that meaning. Memory failed both men. The codebook identified the signal anyway. It was NNJ. Identify yourself. The same method cracked a stranger puzzle. Late in the approach, Sydney ran up a hoist of just 2 flags, the letters IK. The Germans looked it up and got nonsense. A query about storm damage. Have you suffered damage from cyclone, typhoon, or tempest? Detmers thought it must be a mistake and checked the flags himself. It was not a mistake. I and K were the two center letters of the real Straat Malakka's secret call sign. The correct response was to hoist the two outer letters, which only the genuine ship knew. It was a trick question, and the imposter could see it was a question but could not see the trick. The Kormoran made no reply. Minutes later came the lamp signal that ended the masquerade. Show your secret sign. Stop on that detail, because the investigators did. The Germans, under interrogation, correctly quoted the letters of a challenge they had never understood. You cannot invent a detail whose meaning you do not know. The official historian later put it on the record. The fact that the prisoners quoted those letters accurately is itself corroboration of the German story. A lie is smooth. This account had exactly the kind of jagged, half-understood edges that reality has. Even the disagreements ran in the story's favor. How long did it take to hoist the German battle flag when the screens dropped? 6 seconds, said Detmers. 8 to 10, said Otter, who added, unprompted, that the flag measured 2.5 meters by 3.6. 10 to 15, said Albach. 3 different numbers, 1 physical claim. The flag was up before or as the first salvo fired. Whether the German colors were flying at that instant is the question the whole legal argument turns on, because a warship may sail disguised and may not open fire disguised. If those 3 men had rehearsed an answer, there would have been 1 number. There were 3, all small. That is what honest memory looks like from 3 positions on a deck. In January 1942, a Melbourne academic named F.B. Eldridge distilled every protocol into a single consolidated report. Reconstructed from hundreds of separate testimonies, cross-checked against codebooks and captured documents, the account held together. When the Prime Minister released the reconstruction to the public, the wording was chosen with care. It followed, he said, the sifting and checking of evidence resulting from the interrogation of prisoners. Sifting and checking, not trusting. But a story built entirely from enemy testimony has one weakness no method can remove. There was nothing outside the testimony to check it against. No Australian voice, no wreck, no photograph. The account was consistent. Whether it was true in 1942 was formally unknowable, except for one thing. The Germans would not stop writing it down. Part 3. Written for their own. Every account the prisoners gave in the huts at Harvey was, in a lawyer's sense, tainted, made to the enemy under detention, with every motive to self-serve. But over the next 6 years, the Kormoran's men produced a series of other accounts, secret ones, written for Germany, for the Navy, for themselves, in the settled belief that no Australian would ever see a word of them. Australia collected everyone. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Haben, was repatriated in a medical exchange in 1943. Before he left, Detmers examined him every day in the camp until Haben could recite the battle account from memory, like a schoolboy with a poem. The account sailed home inside a doctor's head, beyond any censor's reach. In Germany, it became part of an official Navy publication on radar operations and tactics, used to train officers. And in August 1944, the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's own newspaper, printed the story under Haben's name, How the Kormoran Sank the Sydney. It is written like propaganda, because it is, the captain appears as a lean Frisian figure issuing orders with iron composure. But under the varnish, the moments are the same moments. The siren on a quiet afternoon. Word passing through the ship, it is a cruiser. The demand for the secret signal, and the instant, Haben writes, when the innocent-looking merchant ship was transformed into a warship. Australian intelligence obtained the article, had it translated by a professor of German at Sydney University, and pinned the translation into the interrogation file, where it sits today. The enemy had published his version at home, unaware he was mailing the investigators a control sample. It matched the huts. Detmers himself never stopped fighting the paperwork war. Germany awarded him the Knight's Cross, while he sat in an Australian prison camp. The navy that could not reach him could still decorate him. In the camp at Durringile in Victoria, he built something better than a tunnel. He took a dictionary, and with another officer, Lieutenant Commander Forster, he put faint pencil dots under individual letters, page after page. Collected in order, the dotted letters spelled out a connected German narrative of the battle, a battle report hidden inside a book's own alphabet. On the night of January 10th, 1945, Detmers went out of Durringile with a group of escaped officers. Freedom lasted about a week. When he was recaptured, guards took from him a notebook filled with hand-ruled grids and blocks of letters that read as pure noise. It went to the Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne, the Codebreakers. They identified a Vigenere cipher, a classical polyalphabetic system, and broke it. Inside was an action report and a ciphered version of the ship's log. One of the cipher tables survives in the archive, drawn in pencil on squared paper, and along its rows you can pick out the keyword he chose. Gefechtsbericht, battle report, a captured captain, in his 4th year behind wire, ruling a schoolbook grid in pencil so his account of those 30 minutes could outlive him. It kept going. Another officer, Sub-Lieutenant Bunges, wrote his own account around 1946. When Detmers finally sailed for home in 1947 aboard the liner Orontes, officials searched him and confiscated one more battle narrative. And the dictionary. It was carried past every inspection, home to Germany. After Detmers died, his widow passed it to his nephew. In 1991, it reached the Western Australian Maritime Museum, where a retired Royal Navy captain finally teased the dotted letters out and translated them. Half a century after the guns, the hidden version surfaced, the one Detmers wrote purely for his own side. Here is why all of this matters more than any confession. In October 1947, 6 years after the battle, an Australian intelligence memo in the file compares the latest confiscated report against the deciphered notebook and records the verdict in one dry line. Substantially the same as the code report previously translated. 6 separate versions, produced across 6 years, and only the first of them was ever made for Australian ears. The others were written for the German Navy, for a Berlin newspaper, for a cipher, for the margins of a dictionary, for a man's own homecoming. Men write differently for their own than they do for their captors. These men did not. The story would not change. Even the private soldiers' versions agreed. A crewman named Rademacher kept a personal diary, and the file holds a translated extract. For November 19th, it reads like a telegram from inside the event. 1600 hours, sighted. Signaling Straits of Malakka. Everything ready for fight. 17:30 hours, secret signal. Decamouflage. Bridge distance 900 meters. First salvo, hit aft. Second, bridge hit. 900 meters. In a private diary, never meant for an interrogator's eyes. Closer even than the 1500 the reconstruction allowed. Whatever else was in dispute, no German source anywhere describes anything but a killing at arm's length. And one more document deserves a place here, for what is missing from it. The Royal Navy's own war diary for late 1941, the Admiralty's classified daily record, notes the loss, the rescues, the identification of the raider. Within days, London stops using the name Kormoran and calls her by her builder's name, Steiermark. But in all the diary's pages for the rest of 1941, one fact never appears at all: that the raider was disguised. The false name Straat Malakka is never written. The center of the whole tragedy, the reason a cruiser came close enough to die, is absent from the official record of the war's managers. Even as a Berlin newspaper would eventually print it for the world, one side published the secret, the other side never wrote it down. The investigators of 1941 had done everything the world allowed. Hundreds of separated witnesses, 2 independent channels, codebooks, ciphers, private diaries, 6 years of cross-checks. Every thread agreed. And still, at the bottom of it, The account of how 645 Australians died was the account of the men who killed them. For the families, that was an open wound with a German bandage on it. What happened next took 60 years, and it was not patience. Part 4. The Doubt. Grief needs a place to stand. The families of the Sydney had none. No bodies came home, no grave existed. The Navy could not even tell them, with certainty from Australian evidence, what day their sons died. Into that vacuum, doubt moved like water. The first and heaviest question was about the captain. Joseph Burnett was a gunnery specialist on his first sea command of the war, and he was no fool about the threat. Weeks earlier, he had told his own ship's company that an enemy raider was operating in the Indian Ocean. And the Navy's own tactical instruction gave him 2 ways to handle a stranger. If the sighted ship looked innocent, the procedure was to close to signaling distance and run the ordinary recognition routine without going to action stations. If she looked suspicious, everything changed. Action stations, stand off 7 or 8 miles, and order her to stop under threat of fire. 2 branches, and a captain had to choose one on site. Burnett chose innocent, not for a moment, but for the whole of the approach. Over 80 unhurried minutes, Sydney came down from the horizon to 1,000 meters, guns trained but crew at cruising stations, and stopped her engines beside a liar. The Commission would later find there could be no other explanation for the manner of that approach. Everything a cruiser had over a converted freighter, armor, speed, fire control, a gunnery team at their posts, was worth most at the range he gave away and worth nothing at the range he chose. Why? The dead cannot testify, and the question split Australia for 2 generations. To some, Burnett was simply deceived by a professional. Detmers had rehearsed innocence for a year. He stopped using his rangefinder rather than let its lens betray him. He even radioed a fake distress call, the wireless cry of a merchantman being attacked by a suspicious ship, casting himself as his own victim. To others, no deception excused parking a cruiser alongside an unidentified hull. And to a third group, quieter and angrier, the neatness of it all suggested something else, that the German story was a screen, and the real events had been buried with the crew. The theories grew for 60 years, and they were not fringe. A Japanese submarine had secretly joined the attack weeks before Pearl Harbor, and the government knew. The Kormoran had flown a white flag, or a signal of surrender, to draw Sydney in. German machine guns had swept the water afterwards, killing every Australian survivor, which is why there were none. Secret signals from the dying Sydney had been received and suppressed. Books were written, societies formed, seminars held. Every version fed on the same route. The only witnesses were the enemy, and the enemy's word was the floor the official history stood on. Take away trust in the prisoners, and 645 men had no story at all. And there was one physical object that kept the wound open. On February 6, 1942, 11 weeks after the battle, a Carly float drifted into Flying Fish Cove at Christmas Island, far to the north across the Indian Ocean. In it lay the body of a man long dead of his journey, in blue overalls bleached almost white by the sun. The island was weeks from Japanese occupation. The residents buried him with military honors in the old European cemetery, in a grave nobody had time to mark, and the war rolled over the island, and the grave was lost. He was believed to be from the Sydney, the only one of her company the sea ever returned. For 60 years, even his resting place was unknown. A ship's worth of families, and one anonymous man in the wrong hemisphere. That was the entire physical harvest of November 19th, 1941. 645 households were left holding that. If one of them is yours, a name on the Australian War Memorial's wall, a great-uncle who never came home, a grandmother who waited at Fremantle for a ship that was already on the bottom, then the comment section under this film is the nearest thing that crew has to a graveside. Leave his name there. Because those households refused to let the question die, the search never quite stopped. Amateur historians plotted drift patterns of the lifeboats. Researchers fought over the German coordinates. Detmers had said 26 degrees south, 111 east, and had never wavered. Not in the huts, not in the cipher, not in the dictionary. Skeptics called the position one more German lie, which meant, though nobody quite said it this way, that the entire 60-year argument had finally produced a testable claim. The captain of the Kormoran had left an X on the map. Either the ships were there or the doubters were right. In 2008, a shipwreck hunter named David Mearns and the Finding Sydney Foundation took a search vessel to the X, Part 5, the verdict of the metal. On March 12, 2008, sonar found the Kormoran. 4 days later, on March 16th, 12 nautical miles away, HMAS Sydney, upright on the seabed under 2,500 meters of water. Detmers had given the position as 26 degrees south, 111 degrees east, and had never moved off it. Not in the huts, not in the cipher, not in the dictionary. His own ship was found at 26 degrees 6 minutes south, 111 degrees 4 minutes east. The cruiser lay 12 miles from her. The position the skeptics had called a German lie for 67 years was right. And it was right to the nearest few minutes of arc. Australia did what it does with hard questions. It convened a formal commission of inquiry under Terence Cole with naval architects, ballistics analysts, and thousands of underwater photographs. In effect, the German account of 1941 finally stood trial, with the metal as the chief witness. Point by point, here is how the testimony held up. Start with the range, the thing everyone had argued about. The Germans said the fight was point blank, on a close parallel course. Sydney's portside carries at least 41 15-centimetre hits, 4 of them into the forward turret, and where shells punch through her boat, the paths run almost flat. That is the trajectory of guns firing level across a few hundred meters of water, not shells lobbed in from the horizon. The torpedo, the Germans said, struck early and forward is there too, 20 meters back from the stem beside a turret, and the section weakened by it tore away completely as she went down. Then comes the part they could not have known they were proving. They said their opening salvos wrecked the bridge and the director tower. The steel shows destruction concentrated in exactly those two positions, and fire scarring across the bridge structure and the forecastle deck. The Commission drew the conclusion carefully, as inference and not as fact. Damage there probably killed many of Sydney's officers and broke up her gunnery, which is the likeliest answer to the thing that always looks strangest in the German story, that a cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy took 4 salvos before she fired back. After that, the account has the burning ship turn, pass astern of the raider, and crawl away south, while the Germans keep firing into her far side. Her starboard plating carries at least 46 more hits. The Germans said her boats were smashed and burning where they hung. 5 wrecked boats lie scattered across the debris field. 2 of the findings did more than confirm. The first killed an accusation outright. The claim that German machine gunners had massacred Australian survivors in the water rested on a physical object that had been available since 1941. A shrapnel-riddled Carly float from the Sydney recovered that November. The Commission put it through modern forensics. Shell fragments and blast spool in a pattern matching the battle damage. Not one bullet hole anywhere in it. The massacre story died on the very float it had been built around. The second is the one that should have been impossible to arrange. The Kormoran's radio operators told their interrogators in December 1941 about the false distress call, the QQQQ, sent in the name of Straat Malakka as the 2 ships closed. They described it before anyone told them whether it had been heard by a living soul. It had been. A tugboat and the shore station at Geraldton had both logged a garbled signal at exactly those minutes, and neither log was shown to the prisoners. 2 men in a hut in Western Australia handed the Navy a detail that only the Navy's own archives could verify, and the raider corroborated her crew one last time. The forward 90 meters of the Kormoran sight on the seabed, carrying no damage from Sydney's guns at all, precisely as the survivors described it. The cruiser's shells went into her amidships, into the engine room, and started the fire that killed her. The whole after part of the ship is simply gone, torn into fragments and thrown across the debris field, the signature of several hundred mines detonating together when the scuttling charges fired. Every man who watched that explosion from a lifeboat described it the way the wreckage shows it. The Commission's report runs to 3 volumes, and it is not a whitewash. It records the one point where the metal contradicts the men. The Germans believe Sydney fired 4 torpedoes at them late in the fight, and the evidence says she probably never fired them at all. A fabricated story does not carry an error that makes the enemy look better. An honest memory of a dark, burning horizon does. The inquiry wrote the discrepancy down and let it stand, which is precisely what makes the rest of the verdict worth having. On every material point the Commission found, the German account was accurate, the account of the men who killed them. Understand what actually happened there, because it is rarer than it looks. The prisoners of 1941 were not believed out of trust. They were believed because 2 services in 2 states questioned hundreds of separated men and swept the answers for contradictions. Because a code book proved a half-remembered signal. Because 6 German versions, written across 6 years for audiences that had nothing to do with Australia, refused to diverge. And then, 67 years later, a camera on the seabed checked the file against the steel, hit by hit, and the file held. In 1941, Australia built the case with method. In 2008, the Ocean signed it. The conspiracies each got their own chapter in the report and their own burial. No Japanese submarine, no white flag, no massacre in the water, no suppressed signals. Behind every theory had stood a single human refusal to accept that 645 men could die on the word of their enemies. The final answer to that refusal turned out to be the one nobody wanted and everybody needed. The enemies had told the truth, which leaves the men themselves. HMAS Sydney lies where she fell, a declared war grave, her 645 dead still aboard or scattered near her in the dark. No one will ever stand at their graves. With one exception. The man the sea carried to Christmas Island in a battered float in February 1942, the only member of the ship's company ever returned, lay in his unmarked grave through the Japanese occupation and long after, the unknown sailor of a ship with no survivors. In 2006, an army team found the grave and exhumed him, and the Navy began quietly collecting something it had never needed before: personal details and family lines from the relatives of Sydney's crew. On November 19, 2008, 67 years to the day after the battle and 8 months after the wrecks were found, the unknown man was reburied with full naval honours at the War Cemetery in Geraldton, on the coast his ship never reached, in a town where a national memorial to the Sydney already stood on the hill, looking out over the Indian Ocean. He had a grave now, and an honour guard, and a headstone. He still had no name. Anthropologists measured. Dentists compared. The years passed and the science kept improving, and in 2021, DNA taken from the bones was matched against samples given by Australian families. On November 19, 2021, 80 years to the day, the Royal Australian Navy gave him his name back. Able Seaman Thomas Welsby Clark, of New Farm, Brisbane, 21 years old. And with the name came a life. Born in January 1920 in Brisbane, a grazier's son, a strong swimmer and a keen yachtsman who worked on the family's properties, an accountant in the city before the war. He joined the Army's militia at 19, left it in 1940 to get into the Navy, and trained as a submarine detector, the man who listens for an enemy he cannot see. He joined HMAS Sydney in August 1941. He had been aboard the most famous ship in the fleet for barely 3 months when the signal lamp began to flash. The following June, in 2022, his headstone at Geraldton was replaced with one that carries his name. Think about the shape of that. This entire story began with a demand for identity that could not be met. A cruiser flashing across the water, hoist your secret call, identify yourself. A ship that could not truthfully answer, and 8 decades of consequence. And the story ends with the same demand finally answered for the last man who came home. Not by memory, not by testimony, but the way every hard answer in this history arrived. Segregated witnesses in 1941. A codebook against a faulty memory. A cipher broken in Melbourne. A robot camera at 2,500 meters. And at the last, a strand of DNA against a family's blood. Identity verified. It took 80 years and it was done properly. And if this film has argued anything, it is that those two facts are the same fact. Thomas Clark made it off the ship and into a float, which no one else aboard is known to have done, and no rescue ever came for him. The ocean carried him alone to an island far to the north, past every searching aircraft, and then hid him for 60 years. He is the only one of the 645 with a named headstone. The other 644 have a hull in the dark, 12 miles from the ship that killed them, and a file in the archives that took 67 years to prove itself true. None of what you have heard tonight is legend. The interrogation dossier is real. 491 pages in the National Archives of Australia, the penciled worksheets and the margin notes still on them. The dictionary with the dots under its letters is in a museum in Fremantle. The cipher table with Gefects Bericht ruled along its rows survives in the archives, photographed page by page. The Commission's 3 volumes are public. For this film, we went through those pages ourselves, the interrogation notes, the war diaries, the translated diary of a German sailor, and everything you have heard stands on them. If your family carries a thread of this story, a name among Sydney's 645, who were not only sailors, but 6 Air Force men and 4 civilian canteen staff, or a relative who served in her sister ships, or a Kormoran family on the other side of it, write the name and the ship below. There is no cemetery for this crew. There is only memory, and memory works the way the file did. One testimony at a time, checked against the next. Leave a name, or correct us on a detail, or simply let us know you were here. These men are owed the one thing the scene never gave them, which is to be remembered accurately.